Hello again, Register audience. Welcome back. We're live again today for our RegCast on secure development during digital transformation. This is a really interesting 3/4 of an hour you're going to have if you're involved in security, if you're involved in development. There is a lot of new and interesting information here, and very detailed information as well that we hope is going to satisfy your need for information on this, because you certainly have it. Now, who's going to provide this information? Well, Guy Podjarny from Snyk. Guy, did I pronounce Podjarny correct? Did I pronounce Snyk correctly?
Both correctly, which is not a common
It's not
occurrence.
given, is it? But it's a good start, I feel. Now,
Indeed, indeed.
tell us about Snyk.
So Snyk is really a developer tooling company that tackles security. We have dev-first security products tackling open source security, so finding and fixing vulnerabilities in open source components that you're using, as well as container security, helping you again kind of rein in what's inside of them and what's vulnerable. And we do that both on the sort of freemium community sort of broad tier, all the way up to sort of many thousands of developers at large enterprises.
Great. Now, we are live today, so for our audience, that means ask any questions you want. You can ask any questions. You really should ask them, because I've spoken to Guy a couple of times now, and he can answer any question. I am writing checks that the guy can cash here, because
I'll have an answer.
he
You'd
will
be the
have
judge on the
an
you'd be
answer.
the
Yeah.
judge on whether you like it or not, but I'll definitely have an answer for you.
So test him out. But there is a lot of quite provocative stuff here, and it has a hard message. But Guy, I was asking around on a couple of people about this and describing this to them. So I'm going to drop in a couple of their questions as well. They don't even have to ask now; they've got them ahead of time. The first question that comes in, which is very relevant: is this a RegCast that's aimed at developers or at security professionals? Which one?
So really, it's about both. In fact, and hopefully this would be clear as we go through it. The premise of what we'll be discussing is how does security and how does development need to adapt to sort of this new world, the sort of cloud, DevOps, post-digital transformation world, and the implications it has on development. So, you know, hopefully, if I kind of have my content correct here, this would be useful information whether you came from the dev side of the fence or from the security side. And really, the bottom line message is about how do we need to work together to get this done.
Great, and because there is some information, both sides have to make an accommodation here, don't they? And so please, all of our audience, stay on. Let's not lose half our audience at this stage. That would be terrible. But there are interesting messages and quite hopeful and useful messages for both of them from this. What will we be discussing today? Well, talking about the digital transformation. It's the start of all of this. And what does developer first security mean? We will explain that, and the implications into how both sides of the house work. Guy, I'm going to hand over this to you, because you're going to set the scene for us and why this is such an important transformation to make.
Indeed. Yes. Thanks, Tim. So really, like, digital transformation is, it's a buzzword. It's sort of, it's used everywhere, but it's very real, right? It's a revolution. It's really substantially changing our business, our really almost our lives, and I think we feel it now, with the whole kind of COVID-19 situation and being at home more than ever, about really all of our experience, all of our consumption, whether work, whether personal, is increasingly digital. So there's a lot of ways to sort of slice and dice what digital transformation is, but I would boil it down, for most enterprises, most, medium organizations as well, to three big buckets. The first is more software, so just more of your business becomes digital. The second is cloud technologies, so there's an underlying change to the tech that you build your sort of your solutions on, as compared to maybe what it was, for some of us, today, for some of us 10 years ago. And the third is DevOps, which is more about the methodology. So how do we align our organization? How do we change, our methodologies to develop software on that type of cloud? And what we're going to do is we're going to dig into these three aspects and talk about the security implications for each one of them, and especially for the latter two, more so than the first. And then we'll talk about solution. Sounds good?
Okay, that sounds good to me.
So the first one is probably most straightforward, which is more software equals more software risk. And really, to an extent, this comes down to sort of budget and investment and attention. So if you're a bank and you've moved more of your activity, more of your interactions from the branches to online banking, then more of your risk, more of your data moves to that area, right? If you're an e-commerce enterprise or company and you've moved from selling in a retail store to selling online, again, you need to maybe worry a little bit less about locking the doors and setting alarms on that sort of physical building, and more about your sort of digital presence and how does somebody not break in over there. So what that does imply is, depending on how you are structured before this change, this has implications about who does the chief security officer report to, where in the organization does the security team sit, and what are the primary responsibilities that it does. And what you oftentimes see is, you see actually organizations move the CISO to be a part of the CTO or sort of engineering side of the fence, because their primary, it's not that their only responsibility
Mm.
is the security of the software, but their primary, when you think about where's the biggest risk, of the company, it's around the software piece. And again, we can probably talk about the types of changes per industry, but it's really about that shift. And this is a quote from James Kaplan, who's a really smart. I think he leads the cybersecurity part of McKinsey. And I had the pleasure of interviewing him on this podcast I run called the Secure Developer.
This is your podcast, isn't it? The Secure Developer Podcast. Yes.
Indeed, yeah, where I get the sort of the luxury of talking to all sorts of smart people in security, CISOs and security consultants. And he had a good quote there, just sort of saying, for many companies, cybersecurity is increasingly a critical business issue, not only or even primarily a technology issue. And a key word in that area is, it's not just that security is that, it's cybersecurity. It's that risk that you face
Mm.
from sort of online attacks.
Hmm.
So I think this is not terribly controversial. I think it's fairly straightforward, but it does require just a moment of rethinking, especially if you're a business that has moved from a little bit more of a brick and mortar or sort of in person to being more sort of digital services.
Absolutely. We're going to be looking very much at how that realignment of expectations and demands is going to affect how we do things, aren't we?
Yeah, precisely. So that's the first piece of digital transformation. The next two are significant even for organizations that already were very technology driven, and that's cloud and DevOps. So cloud is, I'm using cloud as an umbrella term for a variety of new technologies, right? Containers, serverless, of course, the cloud itself, to an extent open source, although that definitely predates the cloud. And all of these are newer technologies that help us run faster, help us build software in a more efficient and powerful way. And there's a lot that you can say about the security of these technologies. Probably one of the most common that you see are the fact that it's less mature. So the adoption of cloud technologies and all these surrounding technologies was much faster than any past technologies. And to an extent, they haven't matured as much as others. So for security, that's a little scary, right? It sort of
Mm.
leaves some gaps. Um, and then the other is just this sort of shift of the data center to cloud. So everything is almost public by default, right? You have to think about it. The cloud platforms themselves have have changed their defaults over time, but still, it's a concern. But I think the bigger change that's interesting when you think about managing security internally and not just philosophy, of it, is really that cloud changes the scope of the application.
Yeah.
So let me dig into that a bit. So this is a bit of a a bit of an eye chart over here,
I
right? But
yeah, I always struggle to understand these. So if you explain it carefully, just to help me, even if everyone else is ahead of me.
so I'll go a little bit, like I'll go from left to right as I should. So in the pre-cloud era, when you think about an application, generally the application was a certain, like, some code and some libraries that might be very important, but just the code and the libraries, and they sat on this fairly big IT stack, right? It might go
Mm.
all the way down to like a data center that you run or a co-location. You might have some sort of vSphere or other sort of VM management system. You'd have some Cisco routers, where you might, figure out what portion of the data center has access to others. And then on top of that, you'd get a little bit more broad with virtual machines that, they're better than bare metal machines, but they were still centrally managed by IT. You'd have to provision a VM. You'd have like a packaged app like an Oracle database or the like sitting on the side. And all of these are centrally managed. So there's an IT organization. If you need a change, you file a ticket, you trigger some online process, hopefully online process, to get a change done, to get a piece of it provisioned, to get a modification. And developers really controlled the code and the libraries that run on top of it. But if you look at today's reality, if you look at kind of the cloud era after the transition, the layers are all about the same. Like you still need some machine that runs on it, but it's probably a little bit more underlying. You still need to orchestrate these different machines. Maybe it's more Kubernetes today, just borderline ops
Mm.
versus developer. But all of the next layers have basically moved into the app. So you still have network configuration. You might still leave a port open. That's now done as a part of like a VPC in a cloud or a mesh network or other configuration. You still have an operating system, and it runs. You need to make sure that it's patched or like about its security considerations. But it's not a VM anymore; it's a container, and that container is defined in a Docker file in your repo, and it's patched or built in a build system. Your database is maybe now some MongoDB that you pulled into your container, or maybe it's like like an AWS DynamoDB sort of sitting some cloud service behind it. And all of those things are really controlled now and built as part of the application. The application is more end to end, it's more comprehensive, and you can deploy it on these different areas. It can auto scale. Even this notion of like scaling an application has become software. It's become a property of the app, and it's controlled by developers. And the operations excellence, sort of that skill set, has really transitioned to DevOps, which we'll get to in a sec. But really, alongside all of that, you have these DevOps services. So you have tools that help you deploy, that help you build, that help you monitor, and you have teams, these DevOps teams that, unlike IT ops, they're looking to be a service provider. They're looking to succeed by enabling developers to build, right? By sort of allowing developers to build operable software and to do so more effectively.
I said we get the size of the bracket for the developer from the left to the right. That's really the fundamental change that we're looking at here.
Precisely, and that trend is just growing, right? When you think about
Mm.
data security, that might have been DBA responsibility. That definitely is these decisions, right? Who's making the decisions that can be more or less secure around data? Well, increasingly that's the developer. Delivery. Before founding Snyk, I was the CTO at Akamai,
Mm.
and it was very interesting to see the change of with companies like Fastly and others coming along, where it really wasn't the choice of whether to use Akamai or Fastly, if I had to CloudFront or Cloudflare, was oftentimes partially, of course, about delivery and sort of reliability and speed and all of that. That's the core, but also increasingly, how do they adapt to my ways of working, right? How do they interweave into the app versus be something that is centrally managed and you have to file a ticket to sort of make a change? So a lot of these other things, the API gateways, third-party services choices, all these things are moving into the app. And with that app, they're moving to the developer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So for security, what's important to perceive here is all of the risks are still there. Like it's the same, like an open port, an unpatched system, unencrypted data. All of these risks are the same. They haven't changed really. You could Some are more or less likely, but they're all about the same. But who manages it is very different. And so there's basically this transition of IT security has turned into application security. You need security controls for the threats, but you no longer need an IT security solution. You need an application security solution because they're a part of the app.
Yes, we have actually a comment in here from Gerald already, and I know we're going to get onto this later on, but he is pointing out that what is it, the Stack Overflow Developer Survey? Respondents were asked if they would write unethical code, and 58.5% responded no, which means actually 2 in 5 said, well, yes, they would. So we've got these open source libraries sitting at the top. That is one thing that is consistent. And
Yeah.
there are 2 out of 5 developers say, yeah, we might write some unethical code. And so he's basically saying, how do you use tooling and processes to improve this? Well, that's what you're going to find out in the next half hour, I think, isn't it,
Yeah,
Gerald?
absolutely. So we're going to get, to some practices of how do you successfully do it. But for this slide, it's a spot on comment, which is the person in the organization, right? The group in the organization that will be in the position to decide which pieces of code to pull in or not are
Mm,
developers and not IT. So, do you worry about malicious code within your system? Absolutely. But if before the majority of that concern sat with IT to ensure they don't get any worms into their VMs, now it's really about that developer who's choosing which container they're going to pull down, right, or which npm library that they're using. There's also the whole thesis of ethics on the code that you write and how much you'd be concerned, which also continues to be, developers are just increasingly more powerful, so they can do it to an extent. Developers should be mindful of writing ethical code both in the pre and in the current cloud era, for
yeah.
sure.
Yeah, you can't change people, but you can put some systems in place that means that if people are behaving unethically, then we know who they are. Well, we know what they're doing and we know how to weed it out. So let's have a little bit look at the process. First of all, let's have a look at the shortcomings of the process that exists at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, so we talked about software, we talked about the change in cloud technology, and then last but very much not least is DevOps, right? And DevOps
Mm,
really changes how software is developed in terms of the interaction, including with security. So if we think about DevOps, and again, many ways to sort of, slice and dice it, but fundamentally it builds on two important principles, which are it's continuous integration, continuous delivery. You don't stop, right? There's no gating, there's no delays, there's no stop here and I'll audit. I'll get to that in a sec. And the second is, organizationally, it really builds on these empowered, self-sufficient dev teams, right? It's a single team that is able to take a problem, understand, like get a customer need, be able to write the code, deploy the code, see what happens in the real world, and then kind of rotate that knowledge back in so they can iterate again and again and do that continuously. So these two go hand in hand, and they're very much around speed and around autonomy, because once you introduce dependencies, once you introduce an external entity into that process, you slow things down. And that goes against what we're trying to do. We're trying to achieve that autonomy.
mm. And here's the external entity. Yes.
Precisely. And unfortunately, everything I just described is precisely the way security typically operates, right?
Yeah.
Generally speaking, there's this flow, and security says, well, here I should do a design review, here I should audit, right? Here I should do a compliance check. So it's all about gating. And that gating has, historically also been very manual. Again, central entity, you file a ticket, at some point they get around and they do an audit. They schedule a pen test for you, right? And they would run it, right? You need to book a meeting for a design review. And in the meantime, you sit there and wait. And that, it was never an amazing idea, but in a waterfall model where you can anticipate all these things, you can line them up, you can try to sort of minimize the delay. But when
Mm,
you're continuous and you work in these sprints examples, it just simply doesn't work, right? So the security teams are basically doing the precisely wrong things, like going exactly against the grain, which is they are in the critical delivery path, right? And they slow the business down. So that's, you're going against what your the business need is. They are siloed and out of the loop. So it means even when they do chime in, all the pressure is to basically get the minimum amount of information, and they don't get all the right information. They're not necessarily engaged with the right questions even, and the result of that is insecure apps get shipped. Sometimes bad components get shipped and security was never consulted. Sometimes there's a lot of investment being made on an area that is not that important. So you're either slowing things down, or you're actually probably doing both. You're both slowing things down and you're still shipping insecure stuff. And then all of that is really perpetuated by the talent shortage. Like in the world of security, we're talking 50% of jobs remain unfilled. So even if you were massively security minded as an organization and you budgeted almost like an unlimited budget to really minimize the scheduling delays and all of that, you simply cannot hire enough people, because they don't exist. There just isn't enough security proficiency in the world right now, and security professionals to fill these roles.
Let's take a little bit of a pause there, Guy,
Sure.
because there's a couple of things I wanted to ask you about this. And also, if you have a question for Guy, please let us know. Gerald, thank you very much for that question, because that's kind of helpful to us. You did say that security is doing all the wrong things. They're kind of, on their own terms, they're doing absolutely the right things. They're doing what they're mandated to do. And at the moment, they have the power to say, we have to stop this because we have not approved it. So that they're basically, they're doing a job, but it's not helping the organization, is what we're saying.
Yeah, precisely. Well, and presumably it is helping the organization in that, if a capable security team is still asking good questions, they're still finding security mistakes, and you know, like the vast majority of security people that I talk to, and I talk to many, are very well intentioned. They're not doing this in order to slow the business down, right? Or they're not looking for insecure apps to be shipped. In fact, quite the opposite. But what they're not doing is they're not keeping up. So they're not changing the process, and so they're in constant kind of catch-up mode. But their practices, so like what's really wrong is not with the security people, but rather that the practices are left behind. That's the title here, right? Is the
Yeah.
development world has changed. It's not working the way it did pre-digital transformation, and yet security is, right? If you look at just like fundamentally, how different is it to develop software in a DevOps cloud environment versus in a waterfally, sort of data center and software that you ship? That's that's night and day. How it is in those two worlds. While when you look at what are the typical security practices in those two worlds, they're alarmingly similar. Like they're basically using the same playbook from before for this new world. And of course, like I should say, this is the problem. This is a little bit the sort of pre and post, and there are many forward-thinking security teams that are evolving into the model that I'll talk about in a sec, which are indeed, thinking about these problems and adapting to them. But if you don't, then this is the default state you get to.
And in your experience, when there is conflict of this type at the moment, what happens? Does DevOps get broken because it just can't work fast enough? Or do we get, do they start to work around security? And as you say, we get insecure applications shipped. Or is it just a slightly haphazard way of doing things that no one really quite knows exactly how secure their applications are?
Yeah, I think the default really depends on the organization. So to an extent, business always wins because I like to say that you can be secure all the way to bankruptcy, right? Like the most secure thing for you to do is to just shut down the company, right? And if you hold no important data, then nobody can steal important data from you, right? If you're not plugged into the internet, then people would have a harder time connecting to you. But that doesn't work, right? We're not sort of setting out. There's no business that's out there with its primary goal to be secure. Security is a requirement of a business. And so the business needs they typically do, and they really should bubble to the top. And the business today, to be competitive, businesses need to embrace cloud and DevOps. They need to undergo digital transformation. Otherwise, they would just lose to their competition. The agile, we're in a world where, whether it's startups or modernizing businesses are moving faster than ever. So generally speaking, security needs to adapt or they're getting worked around. How much so really depends on the organizations. Organizations that are much more security minded, like financial organizations, although finance actually tends to be like they invest very, very heavily. So sometimes they manage to still kind of catch up a little bit better. But financial, like organizations that are very security minded, they balance more towards safety versus agility, if in that trade-off. And so they result in moving slower and maintaining a little bit more of that security pedigree. But fundamentally, that's a short-term statement, and I think everybody understands that they need to kind of adapt or die, right? Like they need to switch to this faster moving world and adapt security to it, not the other way around.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions come in that I'll put to you, and actually you might say for a couple of for these, keep watching. Joan's asking, is the solution here for other business professionals to upskill to solve the talent deficit? And I think you have a kind
I'll
of
talk precisely
yeah,
about that. Yeah, in a
exactly that.
sec.
That
So
is
yeah,
exactly what we're
so
going on
hold that
to,
thought.
Joan.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Hold that thought. And Bola's asking, is it more of a communication and ownership issue here about who has the controlling voice? Is it just about that?
Yeah, and I think allow me maybe to progress a bit indeed about sort of talking about how we solve, because I think my kind of next couple of slides talk precisely
They
to that.
are exactly
Yeah,
that. So if you want to know what the solution is, here's what the solution is.
indeed. So So really, the way to address all of this is to take an approach that I think of as dev first security, and let me kind of elaborate on what it means. So again, a little bit of a full slide. If you look to the right, you see a bunch of stats where we asked a variety of surveys, asked our respondents who should own the security operations mostly, and the majority of them think developers should own it, but they're not well equipped to do it, right? And developers, they want to address it, but they don't have the right tools, and therefore they feel it's a constraint for them, right? Like it's something that they're not able to deliver software quickly because security is in the way. So what you need to do is, in the world of security, there's a phrase. I've been in the world of AppSec for many years, and back in the early 2000s, like 2002, 2003, we were already using the term shift left, which implies taking the security controls and at least like automating some of them and putting them into the build, putting them into the IDE, putting them into earlier points in the development process. And shift left is valuable. It's a good thing to do, but it's very insufficient in this world. Like, it made sense as when you were in waterfall shift left, it was very much a
Hmm.
start and an end. But now you have this DevOps, which is oftentimes portrayed in an infinite loop like this one, and there is no left. What's left? It's infinite, right?
Yes.
So really, the real change is top to bottom. The real change is one of empowerment. Security needs to change from being more of a dictatorship, more of a controlling entity that tells you what to do, to more of an enabler, to more of an empowerer, and that helps equip developers with the ability, right, with the tools, with the guidelines, with the sort of the training, so that they can make secure decisions as they go. I like to say, like, when we talk about sort of Snyk's product, for instance, I like to say that I really don't care to optimize for a security person running a scan to find vulnerabilities with Snyk. That's not what they're supposed to do. A developer needs to be able to do that really, really well, and a security person needs to be able to understand which scans have been run and what were their findings very, very well. But they don't need to be the ones running the scans.
Hmm.
Developers should be the ones doing that. So what you need is, you need to move to this balanced world where, on one hand, you have empowered developers that have the right tools and the right mandate, kind of ownership from the organization, to kind of scale security as they develop, right? To secure what they build. And on the other side, you need to have these supportive security teams that are, their job is to build security competency into the rest of the org versus to do the security work. They need to govern, and they need to equip the rest of the org, but they shouldn't be the one applying the security controls most of
I
the
see a
time.
little bit less doing and a little bit more mentoring.
Yeah, and sometimes it's very much doing, but it's not doing as in running a scan, but rather, I think it's very common and desirable, for instance, for the security team to choose a commercial tool or to build an internal tool to give their developers to run to find a
Hmm.
security mistake as they code. So it's very much doing. That team is not just sitting there and consulting. They're writing code. In fact, they've become developers, and we'll get to that in a skill set in a sec.
Yeah.
But their goal is not to be the ones running the pen test. And again, some amount of that would remain. We're talking primaries. So, but their goal is primarily not to run the pen test and find the vulnerabilities. It's not to sit down and triage which vulnerabilities are more important, right? But rather it's to teach to fish, right?
Mm.
It's not to give the developers fish, but rather to sort of teach them how to fish and how to run these types of tests inside, acknowledging that developers do not have the same skill set or time to invest in doing so as they do. And we'll get to the concrete practices in a sec.
Yes, I understand. Yes, because Gerald's asking, how exactly does this work? How do you put the security team back in the
Yeah,
loop and how it works? Well, Gerald, you kind of you're very
yeah,
good at providing the links for us here, because
absolutely.
I think that's what we're going to be talking about for the rest of our time together, isn't it?
Indeed, indeed. And I will just sort of say, before I go into practices, I would say this is a big change, right? It's a
Hmm.
disruption to the industry. It's as big as DevOps, and therefore, like, while you always dislike buzzwords, and DevSecOps is a tricky, it's a buzzword. It's a very complicated concept. It's hard to embody in a word, but it's probably the right term over here, because it's about security catching up to DevOps. And just like DevOps is a massive revolution, and it doesn't just get captured and you do these three things and you've done DevOps. Similarly, DevSecOps is more elaborate. But what we'll do is let's talk a little bit about some of the principles and how do you apply Dev first security, right?
Mm.
How do you change? And so really there's sort of three primary bits of advice that if you were sort of to think about your security practices and security solutions, what do you do? These would help you, progress towards that element. The first is empowering developers. I'll talk about empowering developers, automating fixes, and embedding security expertise. So empowering developers means, you need to acknowledge that taking an auditor tool and putting it into the build doesn't turn it into a developer tool. You have to
Mm.
think about the developer's context and have to think about the developer's knowledge and try to tune the tools, again, whether you built them, you bought them, or if it's the practice around of what you're demanding. You need to think about what does a developer, you know, do, and how do you make it easy for them? Because if it's not easy, we're all humans. We won't do it. We'll find a way around it. So you have to simplify it. A key thing for empowering developers is to describe and like present everything that you do in an application context. And application context is really the lens through which developers see the world. Security is very important to developers, but so are 100 other things. So developers think about their application and they say this application has, you know, these libraries, it has this code, it has these performance properties, it has these availability properties, it has these functionality, of course, this functionality we're offering, and it has these security properties. So instead of trying to shift, what typically happens is you see on the left is for instance, when you talk about known vulnerabilities, you talk about CVEs and vulnerable components in your system, they tend to come from a governance mindset to say, hey, you're using like 500 components and these 17 are vulnerable, and go fish, right? Like, go sort of figure out, how do they get into the system? And that's not a developer context. That's a governance concept. I don't care, how you use those components. I don't care, like where exactly they sit in your system. It's a vulnerable component. It's in your system. I understand that for my sort of triage purposes. For a developer, they used 10 libraries, and those 10 libraries used 100 others, and those 100 used 500. So you have to translate the vulnerability and say, how did it get into my system? So for instance, you go from a list of vulnerabilities to saying, well, you in your code, in this case, a manifest file, I guess in this case, it's a package JSON file, but it could be a POM XML file or any other language. You said I used EJS locals, and that in turn used EJS, and EJS has a high and medium severity vulnerability. Um, and and this context, just not to get overly stuck on like this dependency tree and this application context is very important, but sometimes the context it changes by the problem space. So in the context of containers, for instance, there's a big difference between you use a Docker file. The Docker file, describes the machine you're about to create, but really you can say from a developer perspective, there's a very big difference between the base image that you used. You said I did a from node 14, that's the base image that you did. If that base image has a component that has a vulnerability, your approach to it is very, very different than if you wrote run apt-get install ImageMagick in your actual Docker file. That's almost like it's in your code. And so the action that you would take is very different, right? Do I need to change the starting point, change the base image, which I just picked off the shelf, or do I need to change my code? I need to update it, because if that ImageMagick was installed in that base image, changing your Docker file to now install a newer version of it isn't the right change, isn't the right action. And we'll talk about remediation in a sec. So,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
so
Because we do
base
talk a lot
image,
today about how applications are assembled, not written the code for them, but how exactly they are assembled makes a
absolutely.
big difference. Yeah.
Exactly. And then where is it, right? You want to give the developer a statement that says not just you have ImageMagick in your image and it's vulnerable, but rather it came from your Docker file in this specific line here where you did, run apt-get install, ImageMagick,
Mhm.
or it came from that base image. The second bit, and I'll just go a little bit faster, so make sure we talk about all of them, is the second
Mhm.
bit that's very important for developer usability is fixing. And it's a simple but important statement, which is an auditor's job, generally speaking, ends with finding an issue. They find a problem and then they report it, they triage it, they sort it, whatever, but they basically pass that on for developers to fix. They're, generally speaking, are unable to fix the problem themselves. They need developers to do it. Developer's job is to fix the issue. So if you offer them an auditor product, and it's amazing how often this happens. You offer them a product that was really designed for auditors. The primary functionality in those products is to find a problem. But
Mm.
that's not the primary job of the developer. The primary question the developer brings up is, how do I fix this? Because that's their job. So the second bit, when you think about building security tools and putting them into a dev for security mantle and getting developers to embrace it, is you have to think about simplifying remediation, automating remediation to the extent you can. This is a view of something we do at Snyk, which is, again, there's a fair bit on the slide here, but on the top left, you see that tree that we talked about. So if we know that error handler uses accepts, uses negotiator, then you can say, well, if negotiator is vulnerable, what's the minimum change that I need to do to error handler to fix it? Because I can't fix negotiator. My application never used negotiator. It used error handler. So you want to basically simplify, but everything I just described right now, it's work, but it's not what the developer is being paid for, right? It's not the most exciting work or the work that the developer needs to do. There isn't a ton of judgment. It's discovery, right? You need to figure out which versions of negotiator are out there, which versions of accepts use which versions of negotiator, which versions of error handler use those. And you can take it further. So first of all, you can guide them to say this change in error handler would get you to a safe version. But then subsequently, you can go further out and say, well, do you want to fix these? Give a button that says open a fix pull request, and then open a fix pull request to the repository, like we see at the bottom. And that really is, at that point, your tool is a friendly, like it's like another team member that went through, did all of that process, and handed you the results on the silver platter. And now you just need to review the code, just like you would another developer's team member. Just review the changes, and if all goes well, merge them on.
Guy, can I ask a question about
Sure.
that?
Yeah.
And it's one of the questions that was put to me yesterday. What's the source of truth for this? What is your database of vulnerabilities?
So absolutely. So I think that's a great question. Vulnerabilities. So generally speaking, at Snyk, getting a little bit more specific, but
Hmm.
the world of sort of open source vulnerabilities is requires fundamentally two things, which is you need to know which components you're using, and you need to know which vulnerabilities are known in the world. And so, what really the first piece is a lot of what we talked about here, which is, can I unravel which components are in your system? The second piece is tricky because we do have CVEs, the common vulnerabilities,
Hmm.
vulnerability and exposure numbers, and those are in a centralized database called NIST, which does curate them. But CVEs were created for companies for a small volume, like that you need to know that you need to file a CVE, you need to provide data. There might be some debate about the severity of this, so you might need to go back and forth. And those are things that, Cisco again, right, or Juniper or whomever, when they find a problem and they want to inform to their users, they can do. Um, but an open source maintainer, generally speaking, is neither informed enough or equipped enough or even cares enough to do that, in most cases. And so what happens is they find out about a vulnerability, they fix that vulnerability, they say as much in the release notes, and that disappears into like the ether of GitHub. And so what we do is we listen to open source activity across GitHub, across Apache sort of Jira issues, across researcher social threads. We listen to attacker activity on the dark web, and we find candidate vulnerabilities, and we funnel those to our analysts, and our analysts look and say, well, is this a real vulnerability or not? They give it they curate it properly with the right severity. They add, descriptions and explanations so someone encountering that vulnerability can actually understand it easily, and then they put it into the database, and we use that database of vulnerabilities as the backbone of our product. And for certain organizations, like some cloud giants and some sort of technology giants that have very, very elaborate technology stacks, we actually provide it as a feed, as Intel in its own right.
Okay, thank you very much. That's interesting and important, isn't it?
Indeed, yeah. And I think you have to do it, right? Because if you don't know which components you're using, or if you don't know which vulnerabilities are out there, what are you doing here, right? Like, you have to
Hmm.
be able to trust that you have good sources of information there.
Yes.
So just to be a little bit experienced, just to say, remediation is something that's important. I showed an example of how you can do it, with a fixed PR. Another version of it is just to go back to that base image versus the others. One thing we do there is base images. It's not always clear when you say, this from that you did in that container image that has a whole bunch of vulnerabilities. you should use a more secure one. But then, which one should you use? There's debate, right? You can go to one that's a little bit slimmer. You can go to one that's entirely different and more secure, or you can just do the minimum upgrade. So that's an example where we couldn't really like open a fixed BR automatically, not yet at least. But what we can do is we can tell you, okay, out of the 1,000 Python base images that are out there, here are, you have 900 vulnerabilities in the one that you have. If you went to this minor upgrade, you'd get that down to, to 276, right? If you went to that slim version over there, you'd get that down to 62. So, we give you guidance. It still simplifies remediation, even if you can't take it all the way. So it's important to invest in that. And then, like last but very much not least, is you have to remember the developers are not security experts, and so you have to embed in this case the solution as a security team, as a vendor that you provide to the developers has to embed security expertise, and it needs to be the expert the developer is not. And there's a lot that you can do here, but I'll give a couple of examples. One is you need to provide good information that doesn't assume existing security expertise. For instance, CVSS is a standard way of scoring a severity issue. And practically every security person out there knows what CVSS is, and they know what to do or how to sort of, put it in their mental model when you say it's a 7.3 CVSS, but developers don't. So we defaulted to unravel that and sort of expand out and say, hey, this is, it means that this vulnerability is the attack comes through the network, right? And does it affect integrity or availability of your system? A similar version of it is when you find out about a problem, a key question is there an exploit in the wild, right? Are there tools out there, are there scripts out there that are just continuously exploiting this vulnerability? If the answer is yes, you should prioritize that work. Or similarly, like on a component, this component is vulnerable, but what part of this component is vulnerable? So these are all questions that a security person might know to ask, but a developer might not. And so, we try to package that up. And I'll just kind of quickly jump to one more, and then we can pause, which is another sort of example of like embedding security expertise and guiding a developer with which questions to ask is understanding production context. So, is this vulnerability running in a system that is running as root? If yes, it should be higher priority, right? Or have you exposed? This is what you see at the bottom right, is you see our sort of analysis of Kubernetes configuration, right? Are you when you as a developer even are deploying things into production, are you increasing that exposure, right, and allowing things to run over privileged? So all of those they serve a bit of a double process. One is, of course, they simplify even for a security person. They give them the information they need to make the right prioritization, but bubbling them up to the top, bubbling them up to the view for developers helps developers not just know the answers, but even know the questions, right? Like know which questions to ask.
Very interesting. Who governs this process? If you imagine the security and the ops people work and the dev people working together, is there? We're producing a sort of like a best, a best world that we have here, where they're informed, the security people work with them, they make all the remediation. We know in the real world this doesn't happen. Is there? So how do you see the structures? Who has seniority here?
Yeah, so I think it really is about collaboration. And actually, there are some companies where this happens quite well, or groups within companies as well. And it really boils down to different teams have different responsibilities. I'll use this a little bit as a tee up for how does the security organization and development
Hmm.
organization align. So
Yes,
really,
we do have a couple of questions about that actually. So good.
exactly, from before. So I want to make sure that we cover it. So developers are almost kind of at the center. They're the ones that produce the functionality. They're the ones that are doing the work. So everybody else is a little bit in a supportive mode for them. On one hand, they have DevOps, and on the other side, they have AppSec. So the AppSec to Dev relationship is one where AppSec is the one that owns the governance. Like security, when the CEO has a question about their security posture, right? When there is a security question or a security problem, security team is the one that's going to get approached to. So just like SREs or DevOps teams own reliability, but the way they achieve reliability is not by being on call and plugging every hole, but by equipping developers to write operable software, and developers are on call. It's still SRE is still the one that is kind of, you're going to go to them when you say, well, I want to like increase my uptime from 99.95 to 99.99. And so security continues to be the one governing. They need to know what the status is. They need to equip the developers with the tool, and they're the ones that know what should be prioritized and what shouldn't. And so that's their work. And developers need to be implementing this. And then cloud security is, just as a note, is a little bit of an entity that oftentimes you see in an organization that is part aligned to DevOps, part aligned to AppSec in terms of their responsibility, things like containers or cloud misconfigurations. But
Mm.
what's important to note here, Tim, is that the this is not the default mindset that many security teams have. Again, they're used to being anywhere from the superheroes to the controllers, that jump in and do that work. And so getting to that mode requires some pretty significant changes. They
Mm.
might require organizational change, literally like who your team reports to, where, as we talked, is the CISO, but also, should you, for instance, I like Envision have a great model where they, and actually many others do, where they partner, just like HR or finance has a business partner to different teams. They have an AppSec person that is partnered with a specific set of dev teams, and therefore they join their stand-ups and their sprint planning, and that dev team knows who to approach. So you need to think about your org. You need to think about the skills. For instance, you're going to need probably a lot more sort of software engineering skills within your security organization, and probably a little bit less sysadmin or sort of IT or even pen testing capabilities there.
Mm.
And but really all of those are fundamentally around that mindset, right? You need to motivate people, and to get people that are motivated by succeeding through others, right? By succeeding in that governing element, versus necessarily, you need maybe people that are a little bit more builders than breakers, right? Not just sort of someone who's just looking to like take a system and find all the holes in it, but rather somebody who's more thinking about how do I allow someone to avoid those holes in the first place, or and how do they, like, people that derive satisfaction from it.
Now, this would seem an odd question about a profession that has negative unemployment, but should security professionals be worried that big chunks of their jobs that they like, are going to disappear? Do they have to work on upskilling, maybe changing what they're good at?
Yeah, so I think the answer is absolutely yes. It's not that, there's going to be a lack of jobs necessarily,
Hmm.
but the best jobs are going to change. And I like, so another great guest I had on the podcast was Justin Somaini, and he was the CISO of Yahoo and Symantec and Box and SAP. He's a super smart, super accomplished guy. And his expectation is that security team staff will rotate a third, maybe half, from
Ooh.
indeed kind of that process. So that's probably one of the more extreme numbers I've heard. I had the ADP CISO, Roland Cloutier. He's now the CISO at TikTok.
Hmm.
And he actually underwent a whole reskilling exercise and sort of skill development process with his security teams. Both of them, though, very much acknowledge that it's a big, big change. You can't just take the same people and as is change their job and have them be successful. And if done well, it basically will undergo the same change that operations world saw, going from a sysadmin to an SRE. Like today, when you look at like an IT person that was doing sort of sysadmin and was, caring for all those systems, if you look at the salary of that person, the prestige of that person, even the sort of the actual job satisfaction of that person, versus a system reliability engineer, an SRE today that is in charging, they're night and day. SREs get paid more, they're much more prestigious, they're much more kind of better respected in the business. It's a much better career path. So for those security people that successfully make the shift, it's a big deal. There's definitely gold in them hills, but more, and there's also the stick bit, which is, if you don't do that, you might find yourself relegated to jobs in organizations that are just not the most forward looking, right, and not the most successful as a business in the world. So definitely something to be mindful of.
Mm.
The last thing I will say about this is that the good news for developers looking to get into security is that probably the skills of development within security are going to grow in importance very much, just like, again, we've seen with SRE. So it makes it easier for a software developer to switch to a security job. And you see more and more of that. And I think that's a positive that should also help with the talent shortage out
Mm.
there.
There is a couple of specific questions here because we're getting towards the end.
Yep.
But Gerald's back again. And he's asking, is there a different approach if you're developing cloud native compared to traditional cloud apps. Is this basic? Are you looking? Are you presenting here an organizational change that everyone's going to go through?
Yeah, so like a great question. I think absolutely there is a difference. So if you think back to, I guess I can kind of quickly scroll back to that sort of IT stack element, really you need to separate the cloud from the DevOps practice. Now, generally speaking, you can do DevOps without being cloud native. You can still be collaborative, you can still have autonomous teams, in which case you still need to apply much of this change, but you might not need to worry about your developers knowing how to manage containers correctly, right? Or how to avoid Kubernetes configuration mistakes. If you're in the cloud area, I don't think you can really do cloud well without DevOps. So cloud DevOps is almost a prerequisite. Now, people do it to different levels, but if you are in the cloud area, you do need to think about your developers making decisions around infrastructure as code, around containers, around the choice of services and securing data. So I'd say at a high level, the more cloud native you go, the more DevOps you go, the more this proposition is important to you. Um, in theory, if you've really stuck to like waterfall models that are not on the cloud and are not embracing DevOps, then your security system is a little bit less broken,
Hmm.
and you can consider whether this is right or not. And there aren't that many. There are very specific businesses that might fit in that model. You can think about some industrial kind of systems or such that are very very much are have other constraints on them. Even in those systems, what you see is they're still looking to embrace DevOps, and they're just doing it in a continuous delivery but not continuous deployment model. So even in those environments, they still look to switch to working in sprints to sort of embrace that agility and that change to sort of have those teams be autonomous. So I think it'd be hard pressed to find a company that is not at all on either of these sort of cloud or DevOps journeys.
Just a question of degree. And there is another question here. Should we be holding developers more closely to account for the security of their code? So measuring secure delivery and compensating them against it. Are these sort of
Yeah,
ideas useful?
absolutely. So I think the answer is absolutely yes, and that goes all the way to the top. So
Mm.
CTOs and sort of VP engineering, they should be expected to deliver secure software, and I actually see that they oftentimes are. Um, the security team would continue to be probably the organizational owner of the security controls. So there are basically two models. One is, for instance, what we practice at Snyk is that our application security capabilities are a part of our engineering organization. So the VP engineering actually manages the AppSec team as well. And so in that case, it really works. My had the CISO of Slack, Jeff. He's now at LinkedIn. At the time, he was at Slack, and he talked about how big a deal it was for them to move their CISOs from being reporting, I think it was to the CIO or legal or finance, to moving to report to engineering. So in those
Mm.
cases, literally the security practice moves into the remit of engineering, in which case I think it's a bit more natural. The developers themselves definitely need to be held accountable for writing security issues, but that's not to say that you should expect them to write flawless code. What you should expect them to do is just like quality, just like you don't fire a developer because they write they had a bug, like everybody has
Mm.
bugs. And security is a type of bug. But if you have a developer that continuously, writes bugs and disregards, doesn't write tests, doesn't write, like ships code without sort of proper diligence, they might not stick around your company. You might not keep them in your company for very long. Same goes for security, right? If you have someone who keeps kind of flouting security rules, right, and doesn't give proper attention to ensuring that your customer's data is properly safe, then you might want to consider whether they should stick around or not. I'll say with all of that, the grain of salt is measuring. I think the one thing
Mm.
security is just very very tough to do. One of the things that really hasn't been solved, one of the unsolved problems in the world of security is measuring security, and because you're measuring the unknown, right? Like which
Yes.
use cases that were not intended did you test for, out of this sort of infinite set, and so that's very much a problem. So generally, what you see is you hold developers accountable to paying attention, to investing the time, to following kind of the right steps, but you don't. It's hard to really hold them accountable for thinking about all the different security
For
problems.
potential outcomes that are happening in other counterfactual worlds. Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly.
But yes,
Exactly.
but there are some things that are possible, and I would imagine that would be part of a security organization's remit to be responsible and creative about measuring that.
Exactly. They need to define. It's a security team's job to write, to document and educate on what good looks like, right? And what is it that you're expected to do? And, you know, simple examples go from like you're expected to have input sanitization on every field, that you're taking information on. That's a totally reasonable expectation to make from developers. It's a very straight cut. And you should expect development teams to find that in code review when it was omitted. You expect them to write tests on it. That's legit, right? It's not to say that that input sanitization would be perfect and no exploit can work around it. That's a little bit different. So there's a lot of those. The security teams are the ones to define, the guardrails, to define what good looks like, and to constantly aim to level that up. The development teams need to embrace the responsibility to act on it, right? And to take responsibility for doing the best.
Absolutely. Guy, we've got to wrap up. We've gone over time, but there were so many questions and you had such good detail. I think it's worth it, wasn't it? That was great. There are a couple of links here for our audience. Is there anything you want to tell them about this before we wrap up, Guy?
No, I think the state of open source security is a great place to look in general about open source security and how we do it. I think it's always great to learn from open source, and both practices, but also you need to understand that if you're consuming open source as you should kind of own the security implications. And shifting Docker security left is really around the fact that containers, sometimes you think about them as the evolution of the VM, but more so they're really the evolution of the app, as we talked about at the beginning, right? They're now a scope of the app. So again, as a developer, you need to worry, you need to sort of be mindful, right, of the security concerns there, and what you need to do to address them. So hopefully these two sources of information are helpful. I'd also, the only thing I would add is, a lot of these philosophies are the ones that really drive us at Snyk, and really were the thesis for the company's creation, right? Like we set out to build a developer tooling company that does security and to try and really make it as seamless as possible for developers to embrace security. So, hopefully you find the products themselves useful as well. But even if you just sort of checked out Snyk for seeing how these practices were applied, hopefully you find that educational.
Great. Often the most interesting Regcasts are at the intersection of different disciplines, and this is no different to that. That's been great. Thank you very much, Guy.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. And thanks for all your questions, audience. I hope you got them answered. And if not, there's some information here. And Snyk's website is also a pretty good source of information. Let us know what you thought of this Regcast today. Let us know what you would like to see in the future. If you'd like to see more of this, we will take notice of what you tell us. But meanwhile, from the register, our time is up today. So from Guy and from me, Tim Phillips, and from the whole of the staff at the register, stay well, stay secure, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye.